Hi there. This is the second in a series on the state of nature idea. In the previous episode, we explored why the state of nature matters today. And today we're going to look at how it functions as a way of critiquing our society and a way of critiquing ourselves as human beings as well. I probably should warn you up front that this is no casual glance at the state of nature. It's going to get nerdy, it's going to get political, and my hope is that it's going to get personal as well. Because I want us to think together about questions like, who do we think we are? And how do we think about our lives? How do we think about our society? We're going to cover key philosophical concepts like Orientalism and binary thinking, and the power of myth to shape the way that we see and the way that we experience the world around us. So let's go. State of Nature 101, if you like, is that we who are doing the thinking about the state of nature are not neutral. Asking people within society, like we are, what we think about the state of nature is a little like asking a lion what it thinks of an antelope. It's a fair enough question, but we shouldn't expect a neutral or objective answer because the lion's got skin in the game. The lion eats antelope. And in the same way, when we think about the state of nature, we're not thinking about it from nowhere. Our view is not a view from nowhere. We're looking at it as a way of life outside civil society, from within civil society. And this means, quite simply, that whatever we think of the state of nature is always going to be a reflection on our own interests and our own view of ourselves and our own society. So here's a rule of thumb as we start. When we're thinking about the state of nature, we're always also thinking about ourselves and our own society. And whenever we're reading a particular philosopher on the state of nature, we're always also reading that philosopher on her or his own society and her or his own view of what a human being is. So this then is how it works. We take something that we think defines us in civil society, something that we're proud of, something that we consider an achievement, say our rationality or our refinement or our social order and social hierarchy. And then we project the absence of those values and achievements back onto the state of nature. In other words, whatever it is that we like about ourselves, we say the state of nature doesn't have that thing, doesn't possess that quality. So we're not approaching the state of nature in order to learn about so-called primitive peoples. No, we're approaching the state of nature to learn more about ourselves. So let me ask you a question. It's a very broad question. Do you think we're doing well as a society today or badly? And how do you decide? How do you work out your answer to that question? Well, we decide in part, let me suggest, on the basis of a set of expectations and ideas about what makes a good society. And we decide by comparing our own society to either real or imagined alternatives. And in part, the expectations are set by where we think we came from, where we were before we arrived at our current state. In other words, what the state of nature is. Now, the state of nature is part of what philosopher Charles Taylor calls our social imaginary, the mental and behavioural reality that fills our world, just as much as the physical reality of roads and offices and houses fills our world. Taylor describes this idea of the social imaginary in the following way. He writes that it's the way in which they, people, imagine their social existence, how they fit together with others, how things go on between them and their fellows, the expectations which are normally met, and the deeper normative notions and images which underlie those expectations. So the elements of this social imaginary then shape our lived experience of ourselves and our society and our everyday life. Where we think we've come from shapes how we experience where we are now. And who we think we used to be shapes who we think we are now. Think about it in terms of this example. Blind test after blind test after blind test has been conducted on Pepsi and Coke, and people consistently prefer Pepsi. But when the brand names are revealed, and then people are asked to taste the two drinks, people prefer Coke. Why is that? Because the knowledge that it's Coke is shaping people's expectations. It's actually shaping people's taste. It's conditioning their lived experience of the liquid that they're drinking. So our experience then is shaped not merely by the raw sensations that we feel, the raw taste in our mouth, but by our perceptions, by our expectations. And it's not just that we're deceiving ourselves when that happens. Our experience of preferring Coke, for example, is a real experience. It's just that experience is about more than taste alone. Or take the example of two families. Take one family from a refugee camp in Syria and take another family from Beverly Hills and rehouse them both in identical two-bedroomed single-storey houses in the suburbs of Melbourne, Australia. Well, we'd soon see that it's not the brute conditions of life that shape people's perception of how they're living, but it's the baseline that they're comparing it to. In all likelihood, the family from Syria would be incredibly happy to be in the suburbs of Melbourne, all things being equal. And the family from Beverly Hills may well think that it's a bit of a slum and would wish to be anywhere else but the suburbs of Melbourne. There's no difference in the experience, it's just what people are comparing it to, what people's expectations are. And so we don't just live in a world of things, we live in a world of ideas, a world of expectations. And these ideas, whether it's ideas about Coke or Pepsi or ideas of what it's like to live in a two-bedroom house in the suburbs of Melbourne, these ideas shape our everyday lived experience just as much as the material stuff that surrounds us. What we think human beings fundamentally are, and what we think the state of nature was like, is a key part of our social imaginary. For example, do we think that we never had it so good as we do now in civil society? Or do we perhaps think that something precious and vital was lost when we left the state of nature? Do we think things are over time getting gradually better or getting gradually worse? And this is another way of saying that the state of nature is a powerful myth. Philosopher Mary Midgley wrote a book called The Myths We Live By, and listen to her explain the power that this idea of myth has over it. She writes, "Myths are not lies, nor are they detached stories. They're imaginative patterns, networks of powerful symbols that suggest particular ways of interpreting the world. They shape its meaning." I want to split this down into two categories. First of all, myths make certain things in the world visible to us, things that we might not notice otherwise. And necessarily they make other things relatively obscure by comparison. And also, myths make certain things in the world valuable to us, and other things relatively dispensable by comparison. It's like the famous duck-rabbit image that we can see either as a duck or a rabbit. The myth will predispose us to see it in one way rather than another. Myths propose us to see reality, the reality that surrounds us, in one way rather than as another. They teach us to expect to see certain things out there in the world, and they teach us to expect certain things to be valuable out there in the world. And so, lo and behold, surprise, surprise, we find what we're looking for when we look out on the world. And that's one reason why liberals and conservatives can both look out on the same world and conclude that it confirms their own view, because the myths and the social imaginary that they inhabit teach them how to see certain things in the world and how to ignore other things. And the state of nature then is one of these myths that we live by. It's, if you like, civilization's just so story. It's in many ways our modern creation myth, like the creation myth of Genesis in the Bible. It teaches us what to look for both in ourselves and in others. And it also teaches us what to value in ourselves and in others as well. Was the state of nature, for example, peaceful or harmonious? If we think it is, then we're probably going to lament our own rat race and the society of ubiquitous competition that we live in. If we think the state of nature was brutish and short, by contrast, we're going to value our refinement and the long life expectancy that we enjoy today. In each of these cases, the state of nature is teaching us to see particular things and to value particular things in the world. And mythologizing in this way, seeing the reality that we live in through the lens of myths, it is a key way that we find our orientation in the present. And mythologizing about the past is a key and important way of mythologizing. And that's why the state of nature fits into the way that we experience the world every day. Through mythologizing our past in terms of a state of nature, we give ourselves a set of coordinates for living in the present. And so, for you and for me, the choice that we face is not between being shaped by myths or not being shaped by myths. Now, our choice is between denying that we're shaped by myths at all and therefore leaving ourselves ignorant and vulnerable to how they're actually forming us, or recognizing the power of these myths and becoming active in the construction of our own social imaginary. If you're keen to go deeper into this idea of how myths shape us, let me recommend Mary Midgley's The Myths We Live By as a great place to start. So then let me ask you directly, without overthinking it, what's your first response to this question? Do you think that life in society today is as good as human life has ever been, and likely to get better in the medium to long term? Or do you think that something is fundamentally wrong with our society? That it's dragging people down, that it's stifling our flourishing, and that it's likely to get worse? On balance, do you think there's something pure and natural about prehistoric life, something that we've lost, something that outweighs all the technological, artificial gains of modern society? Or do you see those gains of modern society as outweighing whatever might have been lost since the state of nature in terms of authenticity or lifestyle? In other words, you tell me your state of nature, and I will tell you who you are and what you value. But what sort of myth is this state of nature? Well, one striking feature of its structure is that it is resolutely binary. There are two and only two conditions: either you're in the state of nature or you're in civil society, according to social contract theory. It's like a switch. You can either turn on or off, but you can't be halfway. And this way of thinking in terms of binary opposites like state of nature and civil society, it gives us security, doesn't it? It simplifies things. We're safe inside civil society, and we're as far away as we possibly could be from the state of nature. It makes us secure and content with our own position. It also keeps things very simple, doesn't it? You don't need to worry about how civil your society is, because you know for certain that you're in civil society rather than in the state of nature. And just in case you think that such crude binary thinking is confined to 18th century political treatises, let me remind you that this sort of binary language is used all the time to talk about our societies today. It's hard to go through a news bulletin without hearing about, for example, developing countries and developed countries. Developing making it sound as though these countries are somewhat backward, and developed making it sound as though there's no more developing to do. It's a very binary way of thinking. Another example is that we still talk, don't we, about the first world and the third world. Another binary opposition. We talk again about Western nations, sometimes opposed to the East and sometimes opposed to the global South. Binaries again. We sometimes look back on an age of superstition from our own achievement of enlightenment, another binary division between cultures. Let's think about this last point a little bit more. We seem to like defining ourselves against other individuals, against other groups, against other societies. In fact, we don't seem to be able really to understand ourselves at all, unless we contrast ourselves with something that we're not. You'll know about the fish who was asked the question, what is water? And answered that it had absolutely no idea what the questioner was talking about, because it had never experienced anything apart from water. It had never thought about it before. Water was simply what there is. Well, in the same way, civil society doesn't really know what to think about itself until it can contrast itself to something, until it can compare itself to something outside itself. For example, are we doing well as a society, or is our society an absolute disaster? Well, it depends what you compare it to. And what you compare it to is always a strategic choice. We've got an interest, haven't we? We who live within civil society, of painting the state of nature in particular ways. We might want to justify our civil society, and then we'll paint the state of nature in a particularly crude way, or we might even want to critique our society, and then we'll paint the state of nature in a particularly rosy way to allow us to perform that critique. If we want to say that our society is great and we should protect the social order at all costs, like Thomas Hobbes did, we're going to paint the state of nature as something that is, to use Hobbes' phrase, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish and short. And we're going to paint that as the alternative to the civil society that we live in, such that nobody is going to want to return to that because it's so awful. But if we want to say that our own society is corrupt or unfair, then we're going to paint the state of nature as a full of satisfied, equal, compassionate people, so that our society looks so much the worse when compared with it. If we become obsessed with the natural, it's probably a sign that we're dissatisfied with ourselves and with our society. And because most of us like to take comfort in the thought that we are doing pretty well as a society, really, despite everything, most versions of the state of nature tend to be decidedly worse than our contemporary society. Now, very interestingly, we're going to look at this in the next video, Rousseau's second discourse is an exception to this rule, and that is one reason why this particular text is so fascinating as a description of the state of nature. So then, the state of nature sets a norm. It sets a set of coordinates in terms of which we situate our own society, and by virtue of which we judge our own society. Now, just in case you're thinking that this practice of defining ourselves against another to understand who we are is just something that other people do, or just something that they did in the past, or just a particularly crude way of thinking, let me try and bring it closer to home. In the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, perhaps you see yourself as not like those irresponsible anti-vaxxers who put the rest of us in danger. Or conversely, you might see yourself as not like those gullible sheep who believe anything the government tells them and don't stand up for their own freedom. Political parties in all countries define themselves, don't they, in large part against the opposing parties. And we do the same with our own personal politics. I'm not like those liberals. I'm not like those conservatives. Just notice how news outlets with a political bias often do more talking about the other side than they do about the position they support. We all look to other positions to define our own and to help us understand our own. And that is what the state of nature is doing. What is civil society? Well, look at what preceded it. Look at what's outside it. That'll tell us who we are and what we value. In all of this, state of nature discourse has a lot in common with Orientalism, a term associated with the late social critic Edward Said and his book of that name. Orientalism is the way in which, over centuries, the West has projected an image of the Orient as its own other. The West is rational, for example, therefore the Orient must be superstitious. The West has science, therefore necessarily the Orient doesn't, and so on. The Orient is the other, by contrast with which the West can understand and take pride in its achievements and look down on those who are different to it. So I just want to think now for a moment with you about the similarities and differences between the discourses of Orientalism on the one hand and the state of nature on the other, because I think both similarities and differences are really helpful for us in understanding our own world and our own sense of ourselves. Let's start with the similarities. Well, the East, the Orient, and the state of nature are both discourses that the modern West has used to understand and largely to justify itself. Secondly, both the East and the state of nature stand in relation to the West as its other. We understand ourselves as not this, not Oriental, not in the state of nature. Thirdly, a lot of state of nature discourse directly references non-Western others. So there's a thematic overlap between, for example, the way in which inhabitants of the Americas or of African nations are described in terms of the state of nature and the way in which inhabitants of Eastern countries are described in Orientalism. And fourthly, in Orientalism, the other is the West's own genealogy, if you like, through the Bible lands, Jerusalem, the language of Hebrew and so forth. That there's a sense in which in looking to the Orient, the West is understanding where it came from itself. And similarly, in state of nature discourse, the West is directly looking at what it thinks came before it. This is what preceded our civil society. This is what we grew from. And so both of these discourses are genealogical for the West. But there are also really significant differences. State of nature discourse focuses on a supposedly non-organised society, usually of hunter-gatherers, or Native Americans. Hobbes or Locke will make reference to Americans or to Africans. Whereas Orientalism isn't about, from the Western point of view, a disorganised society at all, but it's about the very organised and sophisticated societies of the East. A second difference is that the other of the Orient remains geographically and temperamentally different. In Orientalist characterizations, the Orient is very much not like us, very much separate from us, the West. But by contrast, the state of nature remains buried in who we are. It threatens to return. That's Hobbes' whole argument about civil war. We could find ourselves back in the state of nature if we're not careful. There's no equivalent of that in Orientalism. And thirdly, whereas Orientalism compares the West with another alternative culture, the state of nature discourse seeks to compare Western society with something supposedly neutral, some baseline of human life outside all society, if you like, a cultureless existence. So can we talk about a state of nature Orientalism, a way of thinking about the state of nature using the tools and the language of Orientalism? With a certain amount of caution, I think we can. I think that's a helpful way of understanding the state of nature. It is, just like Orientalism, an other that we project in which the West is fundamentally entwined and which tells the truth of its own nature, probably in state of nature discourse more fundamentally than in Orientalism, because the state of nature tells the West who it thinks it was, and in many cases who it still is under the surface. And another way that Orientalism helps us think about the state of nature is that Orientalism isn't really about the East at all. The appropriate question to ask of an Orientalist discourse is not, is the East really the way that it's presented in this Orientalist discourse? Now, what's interesting is not whether it's true, but what it reveals about the West, what it reveals about the one producing the discourse. And in a similar way, what's important about the state of nature is not whether it's true, but whether it has explanatory power and what it reveals about the West that's producing this discourse about its own origins. It's missing the point to ask, did the state of nature really happen, as Rousseau, for example, or as Hobbes describe it? It's not a meaningless question. We'll return to it in another video, in fact, but it's not where the state of nature is really interesting. It's not where the rubber hits the road. So then, the state of nature is no quaint historical idea. It was, and it remains, a powerful tool of self-definition for the West looking at itself in a mirror, so to speak. It's a discourse most often of self-justification, the West congratulating itself and saying what a wonderful job it's made of society. But it's also, from time to time, a discourse of self-critique, and we'll see this particularly in Rousseau, of the West looking at itself and seeing what a mess it's made of society and how it needs to put things right. In the next video, in fact, we'll begin looking in detail at Rousseau's account of the state of nature.